Hi, everyone. Welcome to Life Edge, because life just doesn't have to be mediocre. I'm Rick Zanotti, and I'm joined today by my good friend, coming to us from Oklahoma. She is Dr. Susan Nash. How are you, Susan?
Great. We have a great guest, and we're going to talk about helium, which is flying high.
Here
I
we
couldn't
go.
resist.
This show is sponsored by Relate Corporation. Digital learning development, media development, corporate video, management consulting, and more. Visit us at www.relate.com. Thanks.
And we are back, and Susan, please do the honors.
Okay, well, I'm really happy to announce today that our program today is about helium and some of the activities in conjunction with natural gas production and some of the opportunities. And we're going to talk with Dr. Steve Tedesco, who is also going to be part of a special interactive session on helium opportunities at AAPG's annual convention. And there's also a special session on helium as well. So, Steve Tedesco, Dr. Tedesco, we're really happy to say hello again. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, can you tell us a little bit about what helium is here in the North American mid-continent and what Rocky Mountain area?
Well, if we go to the first slide, helium is used in a variety of things that we really don't think about. Cryogenics, computer chips, manufacturing fiber optics, and what is very critical for the oil and gas industry is welding and leak detection. Then there's several other uses of helium, uh, pressurizing and purging, growing silicon and germanium crystals, but mostly for the kids, it's for having balloons. And right now, there's a shortage of helium worldwide because the big facility down in Amarillo, Texas, that the BLM controls is basically going out of business.
Hmm.
It's this as much helium as it can economically, and it's in decline. In North America, as a matter of fact, the U.S. is one of the major, if not been the major source for helium for several decades, and it's been not been looked at around the world very readily. It's very much a sort of secondary byproduct, and when it's only small amounts and $20 or $10 an MCF, subsequently that has changed to where it's anywhere from 300 to over $1,000 an MCF. For example, in an MCF of gas, there's about 28,000 liters, and those same liters of helium will sell for €6 in Germany, France. So that comes out to about $128,000 for an MCF of helium at the retail level. So it's a very expensive product that we need um, quite a bit of. And the other areas in the country are in central Kansas. Rush County has been a major source of helium, as well as parts of Utah. Uh, there's a lot of people looking in places like northwest New Mexico, where there's several helium deposits that have been known for years. But one of the biggest problems that we're seeing right now is the cost of the cryogenic plant. That's the major stumbling block for most people getting into helium.
Wow. So, is there any potential in Canada, for example, as well?
Yes, there is a lot of activity. Helium's related to the decay of uranium and thorium, also from lithium. And based on the literature, the source is supposedly the mantle, but I'm sure it's variations in the Precambrian rocks that are decaying, the uranium and thorium is decaying, and where you have a tremendous increase in that, you probably see more helium. But Saskatchewan is a hotbed of helium activity. There's helium in southwest Ontario, but many of these areas have not been aggressively pursued. Exploration just for natural gas and oil is very similar for helium. Our database, which is very extensive. The data, though, is very questionable at times because it's sampled from DST or flow rates from a well that you don't wonder what uh, the containers were used, if there was leakage, how it was handled, and that sort of thing. So it's very trying to find it aggressively is very difficult. You'll spend a lot of money. Go to slide number 2 and just go through these. So without helium, there are no MRIs, no helium. Then we go back to the computers of the 50s. So what would the PC of the future be? The next slide. What is the origin of the Earth's helium? It originates, as I said, from radiogenic decay. Amazingly, helium is considered one of the most common elements in the universe, but seems to be lacking on the Earth, which brings me to the conclusion that it's either they've miscalculated helium in the rest of the universe, or for some reason there's no helium here, because it just doesn't seem right. There shouldn't be more helium because of it's so common. Number 4, helium is just a couple protons and 1 to 2 neutrons. It's very non-reactive, but it's used in quite a few things. It is, like I said, low concentrations. In the atmosphere is about 5.2 parts per million. Very low boiling point. That's how they get it separated from the gases. They basically freeze the gas until the methane et al. Just drops out as liquids and the helium is separated. And then it's obviously goes into one container and the rest goes into another container. The economics, as I said, is very exciting. It costs about $100 to $175 per MCF to process. Typically, we're looking at deposits of 1% to 8%. And historically, they've been 5% or more, but we're getting in a situation now, and I'm looking at several deposits that are just at the 1% range, and with the right volume of gas are very economic. So how is helium trapped? Well, helium is basically trapped structurally. There is a PhD out of England that started a playoff in Tanzania suggesting that helium is trapped in the groundwater in more of strat traps than structure. But that play in Tanzania, which was, I think, had an article in the APG Explorer a few years ago, has not been developed, and I have no idea why. Supposedly it would add 3 BCF of helium to the world's resources and basically make it very cheap, but I'm not certain what's going on there. And then finally, we just migrate to a structural high. And right now, I think that that's what most people should be looking for is structures where the helium can accumulate. And then the last 8th slide was Tyler, I forgot his last name, with the state of Utah, is putting together this map along with the publication that's in process. I'm not sure when it's supposed to be printed, especially with world events. But he's done a lot of work with the data, and you can see that the Rocky Mountain region, especially the Piceance, is very full of helium. The mid-continent in the U.S., southeast Colorado is very much known for its helium. Right now they have a shortage down there. They have a 40 million a day plant that's not has enough gas to process helium. So we're in a great need for helium. And up in Wyoming, Exxon has a major facility. That's another major source of helium. Outside of the U.S., what we see is Qatar and Russia are starting to gear up for quantities of helium. But because of the instability of those two sources, Europe is looking towards the U.S. For its source of helium, and possibly Canada.
Steve, what about Argentina? Because I heard they have a lot of uranium in Argentina. Any helium there?
That I don't know of. I haven't heard anything. They have a lot of coal gas. They have a lot of shale gas.
Yep.
And right now, we're not seeing those type of gases. I haven't seen the evidence that those gases contain helium.
Okay.
That's really interesting. My first job after I graduated with my degree in geology was with Diamond Shamrock in Amarillo. And I remember going out into the field, and I always would pass the helium fields and the helium plant just north of Amarillo toward Dumas. And it just always fascinated me. And I mean, I just wonder, why is that closing down? Is it because of lack of production or depletion?
It's depletion. Basically, the Hugoton, it's basically part of the Hugoton field is an extension of the same field in Amarillo, and it's just basically depleting at a tremendously fast rate. And subsequently, their facilities are designed to process gas at large volumes, so they can't keep up. There is a group out of Dallas that does smaller plants, and other companies like Praxair will do smaller plants. And smaller plants seem to be the wave of the future in terms of targeting helium reserves. I mean, it doesn't take very much. You don't need a BCF of gas to make it work. It could be in the 20 to 50 million cubic feet of helium range. Just depends on where it is and the longevity of the gas source.
Are there any
Wow.
other gases that could somewhat replicate what helium can do, or is it pretty unique?
It's pretty unique. It's just one of these gases that it's like some rare earths. They're some of them very specific to applications that they have not found a successful substitute for.
Now, you mentioned that if we didn't have helium, we would go back to very old type PCs or computers. What is that used in semiconductors?
Right. One of the previous slides, they grow silicon and germanium chips in the helium atmosphere because
Did
it's
not know that. That's
very
interesting.
stable. Yeah, and I mean, and also, where would the world be without party balloons?
That's right.
So, when you use hydrogen, we're going to have things blow up, and that's why I don't believe a hydrogen economy is around the corner. First few cars that blow up, that will be the end of that.
That's yeah.
Well, so you talked about the cryogenics, and I mean that's one of the big challenges also of creating in situ or on site LNG. It's just the cost of dropping the temperature to the point where it's below freezing and freezing the gas and doing the separation. How do they generate the energy to do cryogenics now? Is it the natural gas that's co-produced?
Well, right, but there are out in Utah where I'm. One of my projects is, and we're next to the Harley Dome, that has about 8% helium and the rest 92% nitrogen. So they're suffering from them. They have to provide their own source. Whereas present day, if you can get 2 million a day in natural total gas and with 2-3% helium, the natural gas can be converted into electricity. What I look for is putting it in association with an oil field and send the rest of the gas down into the reservoir to basically do a natural gas flood. And you can even do that with slugs of water. One of the problems with many states nowadays is venting and flaring natural gas, and that's coming to an end. Fortunately or unfortunately, but it's been a tremendous waste of energy. And so the best thing to do is put it back in the ground. Why not do it with an oil field that you can flood? It's not a very efficient oil field compared to a water flood in some cases, but a lot of gas floods existed in Kansas and Oklahoma in the early 20s, 30s, and 40s, and to the 50s, and then they went to water when they found it was more efficient, but you can still move a fair amount of oil.
I really think that's great, and I'm with you too with the complete waste of energy by flaring. I mean, there's just no need for it. I mean, for example, being able to use it to help separate out the gas, or even generate electricity for whatever use. But I'm fascinated by the fact that in Utah it's part nitrogen and helium. What is the difference in the geology that makes it so that unique reservoir?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I don't think anybody really has the answer to date. Looking for these helium deposits have been more like stumbling into them and not necessarily with a planned exploration program. They're sort of like Mississippi Valley type deposits. You just stumble into them, and then you find the big viburnum trend, or like Leadville here in Leadville, Colorado has an MVT deposit. And same within the oil business where we have MVT deposits like Albion, Scipio, Lima, Indiana trend. They just all found by accident. And so it's only through some analysis of natural gas that sometimes the operators analyze for helium, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they analyze for hydrogen, which is related to not only the gases, but also supposedly related to helium. Um, and why some deposits are completely full of nitrogen, I'm not sure. In southeast Colorado, as you go towards Denver from the Kansas-Colorado border, you have more and more low PTU gas. The amount of helium doesn't increase tremendously, but it still increases. And nitrogen is supposedly sourced by basement rocks, and that's been the main uh, theme in most articles that have been written. But no one's really taken apart what is the real source, why is it collecting here and not there, why is it in some areas like in Rush County, Kansas, why is it collecting there and not in neighboring counties like Russell? So it's just a question of trying to figure that out. Unfortunately, most wells don't go drilling to the basement and take samples. They stop at much shallower zones because that's where the oil and natural gas are.
So what are the Chinese doing? Because they tend to assemble just about everything out there right now. How are they getting their sources? Is it from us or from others? They already have quite a bit of the natural, I guess, trace minerals and everything else. They seem to have, I heard it was like 95% of them. As far as gases go, I'm not sure geologically they're pretty spread out. They have a little bit of everything. Do they have
Right, but we're, go ahead.
no, do they have any natural sources, or are they dependent on others for that?
No, they're dependent upon us and others, and there's only Russia, Qatar, and the U.S. right now that supply
Okay.
most of the sources of helium. I mean, some of the other countries have minor sources, but it's nothing compared to what is needed for all sorts of technology in a Western type or technology-driven society.
I'm just really interested in what you said about the Mississippi Valley type deposits, because to me what that
Right.
means is that it has a lot to do with heat flow. And if we could go and reconstruct the heat flow, then we could have an idea of prospectivity through time. I mean, we could go through the heat flow through time. Have you done anything like that?
No, and helium is more related to decay of uranium thorium, which probably implies
Okay.
there's a hell of a uranium source in the basement below that's shedding all of this helium. And then lithium also sheds helium, and there's a couple other elements that do as well. But primarily, they think it's uranium thorium. In terms of the Mississippi Valley type deposits, the reason you can't find them is they're blind deposits generally. You can only sort of get an indication of where they are in an area by seeing sort of teasers and samples from wells or at the surface and outcrops. But how you go find where that came from or what system it's part of is always difficult. So yes, both may be related to heat flow, but they're both, to me, very difficult things to quantify and find.
So
So
for
no
anyone,
indicator minerals like arsenic or something.
Well, no one's done anything. Now, another element that's always associated, it seems, is neon. And this neon is basically limited to neon lights, but it seems to be associated with helium in terms of being anomalous when you do a soil gas survey, sometimes when people analyze for it in the gas stream, which is not very often. And that may be a helpful tool, but if you've got neon, you've also got helium. And so right now that doesn't seem to be that useful. The helium, the helium is basically non-reactive to anything else. So um, uh, there's no pathfinder elements.
Okay.
so helium is kind of the gold of a mineral, where gold is pretty much standard frequency, nothing really. That's
Right.
fascinating. So what happen? What
What you do
happens?
know is that it's related to large volumes of natural gas. And
Yeah.
if I'm drilling a natural gas deposit somewhere and I've got 10, 20 million a day, one of the first things I will do is I would analyze it for helium.
Hmm.
And even if your gas has never been analyzed for helium, if you're making 10, 20 million a day right now, I'd look to see if it's got helium in it. There are helium deposits in Ohio, in some of the other states. They're very isolated, but they're still, I think the ones in Ohio related to that rifting that's occurring, they found a few years ago under the central part of the state. and it does seem to be related to rifting. However, the Tanzania deposit's never been developed. It's got very high numbers, no confirmation of analysis. Being a scientist, you want to sort of have some confidence in the data you're getting. And so we've analyzed some of our gas flows 2 or 3, 4 times to see how the helium changes through production, which is critical because there's some cryogenic plants that have gone in place out there, and then the helium peters out in a very short period of time. So that's the other thing that scares investors is your helium life may be 1 year, and you really want 5, 10, 15 years.
It's kind of
So
it's the
where's
kind of
is there
problem.
anything in the Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying it's the kind of problem nobody thinks about. That there'd be a helium problem of all things. Everybody talks about gas and this or oil, but not helium. It's actually very interesting, and it's also interesting how much it's used in, which people probably again don't think about
Right.
very much.
Right.
So
Well,
what
it's like
happens?
graphite.
So it sounds like we're not depleted, but the price would probably go up. Or at one point, do you have any predictions on depletion, depending on how much new stuff they find versus what's already existing?
Well, helium is just like natural gas or oil.
Mm-hmm.
You start running out of it, what our industry does is race out there and find all sorts of new deposits, floods the market, and
Okay.
craters the price.
Yeah. Yep.
But helium is one of those things that is very necessary. There's not an alternative for.
Okay.
Well, so I was just wondering, we're doing all this work in the North Sea and going back to the old fields, and there was a lot of gas there, and also Netherlands, et cetera, those massive gas fields. Is there anything, I don't think it's a rift though, but I was just wondering if some of the old depleted fields could encounter some helium or in some areas that we haven't really thought about offshore.
Well, I think deposits like that have let a lot of helium go. But the question is the bigger the company, the more difficult it is to get them to take the time to look at something like this. And I think that once again, the smaller companies are going to lead the way in terms of getting more helium out. I'm dealing with the Bureau of Land Management, and they're like very giddy people that I came to them and said, I want to produce helium from some federal lands in Utah, because they are tasked with finding new source of helium ASAP on their lands or
Oh,
anybody else's land. So, I mean, it's probably one
that's good
thing
to
that
know.
will not, sorry?
That's good to know. In fact, isn't there a lot of BLM land in the Texas Panhandle and also Oklahoma Panhandle? I was surprised to see that they control
Yeah,
some.
but
I know that.
if you look at that map that put up there, there isn't much indication of helium in the area.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, but someone drills a well out there, they might find a small deposit. Helium tends to be at the top of structures. So if you have a structure that covers several thousand acres, it might only be at the top of the 1,000 acres on top of a 10,000 acre gas structure.
So in essence, for all the people who worry about everything and anything, and there's lots of them, this is one more thing for them to worry about, isn't it? Helium.
Yes, it is. I think
Uh,
we should have a
yeah.
CNN report on this. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
we've got a comment from the audience, actually. We have Jeff Aldrich, who says, Steve is spot on with the source, but the trap is very key. Actually, you never really trap helium, you just slow it down.
Well, that's true of everything. I mean,
Well, that's interesting,
oil and gas
Jeff.
is
Maybe Jeff can
migrating.
elaborate.
Yeah, if you don't have a seal, everything goes to the surface. But he's very right though in terms of that helium is being just delayed. Um, if you get a lot of helium in your soil samples at the surface, it's probably a breach trap. And then if you get subtle anomalies, that's probably better because there's more shale over it than there is carbonaceous mudstones like shales, which have a lot of fractures, breaks, and everything else. So I agree with what he's saying.
Jeff, do you have any Any insights? You want to type them up? I find it really fascinating because it shows a flow, that there's like a long-term, long-time flow. And if there's no real trap, it's just slowing down, then that means that surface methods could work, whether or not they work on. Have you used any surface geology or surface sampling, Steve?
Well, soil gas surveys are very common for helium.
Okay.
One of the things you have to remember is that actually helium is recharging itself through time. How much can accumulate it and quickly is, I'm sure, a real question. But if it's shedding off from the basement, it's shedding off constantly and just migrating up. So it may not be enough to keep the reservoir productive.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. And the completion methods for a well are the same as for any other well. Um, you know, if you've got water, you got to move the water, but you just perforate and it flows naturally. It flows naturally. So there's no special conditions that you have to worry about as far as my experience has been.
So if you're in a zone, do you know exactly where the helium is coming from? Can you see it on a log? Or do you just have to go by DSTs and samples?
Well, it's just part of the gas. And that's, DSTs are fine, but I prefer to run pipe. I do think in parts of Kansas and maybe southeast Colorado and Oklahoma that DSTs are very important because you can almost calculate your production rates from them. But in other areas, they just mislead you a lot of times. So the best thing is do run pipe and production test.
So what would your advice be for a small producer who wants to get into this? How do they get started?
Well, I would look at the existing gas wells that I have and see if there's any helium in them and how much, and then look at the flow rates. I mean, if you're making 20, 30 MCF a day out of a dozen wells, that's probably not going to work because the cryogenic plant is at least $1.2 million or more. And so for a producer to get into it, they need to look at areas that are not being aggressively pursued, but may have shut-in gas production that might have helium. Some of the areas that seem to be productive for helium also are in biogenic gas areas, which I find interesting. And so it's just a matter of doing the research and that sort of thing. And the main areas people are focusing on is in the Panhandle, Yucatan, and Rush County, and then out near Harley Dome. There's some areas in southern Saskatchewan. Northwest New Mexico has several fields. I don't know the production history of them, but they always seem to pop up as prospects every few years with some operator going in trying to strip the helium out of it. It's in the 5 to 11% range, I think, but they don't seem to go anywhere. But the BLM is very aggressive about getting people on federal land to get helium out of it. And there's areas with no helium in the natural gas at all.
We've got another comment from Jeff. He says, helium migration appears to charge and trap much slower than most HC systems. You look for high uranium concentration.
Oh, interesting.
Well, I'm not sure they do that, but that's possible. I just think that the oil and gas is in more volume, so the recharge is going to be greater anyway.
Well, that's cool, Jeff. I like that comment, Jeff, because it means that someone could use petrophysics and use well logs, at least gamma, to at least kind of get a sense of potential areas of, especially if you're looking back at well logs, like you're thinking I want to go re-enter or recomplete, or looking at an old field, that there might be some hope there. Just thinking out loud. Well, this is really exciting. Steve, do you have any other thoughts?
No, I don't. I mean, I think I've covered most of it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's one of those things that, again, I think most people aren't really that aware of. and it's an interesting in how many things it's used in. So, good luck to us all.
Well,
That'll be a good
yeah,
one.
and coming and looking ahead, I think Ron Broadhead, who has many years of experience with helium, is widely published. He's going to be a part of that special session that I mentioned that will be at the annual convention, and also an interactive session. And Steve, you put together some other experts. Do you want to mention who will be part of that interactive session?
Dave Senishin, he has his own soil gas company. Then Tyler, and I apologize, I don't have his name up, out of the state of Utah, who's very much done a lot of work. And Dave Newell with the state of Kansas. I've known him for a few years, and they're started to focusing on helium as well, because right now they need revenue for the state.
Oh, that's really good. And then I know that a lot of people have been interested. I know there are other people that are actively involved. I think Jeff Aldrich obviously is, and a few people I was recommended in Canada. I think that's good news for Canada too. So anyway,
Kyle
this is
Weiss,
really exciting.
that's true. Yeah.
Actually, that was great. With Dr. Steve, a pleasure having you on again and sharing. This is actually really interesting and important knowledge. So thank you for sharing, and good luck in finding more helium. It sounds like it's there. It's just a question of finding where. And
Right.
and Susan, again, thanks a lot. And we will be back next week with another episode of Life Edge. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.